New York? Century? Architecture school? Design school?
What is a designer? Okay. I don't know, because there's so many different designers, and I guess each one is as individual, following whatever they believe is the best method for them to work. I was fortunate in having an incredibly rich education. It was like I was born with a platinum spoon in my mouth. I started out in art very, very young. And when I went to high school, I had one of the country's foremost art teachers in a special program at Lincoln High School. His name was Leon Friend, a very gifted man, and I was on the art squad, which was a privilege beyond belief. There was even a retrospective of Leon Friend and his art squad members at the Museum of Modern Art years ago. Also at that same school was a teacher of theater named Gustav Bloom. Gustav Bloom was the head of the WPA program for the restoration of the theater. And it's hard to imagine the influence of those two very special gentlemen on a very young man, and the introduction to both theater and art by two of the better people in America. I went to the Irwin Piscator Theater in the 40s and saw remarkable productions of Shakespeare, experimental theater, and learned to draw, learned to speak, learned to think, learned to bring some spiritual quality to the creation of any work. I was told that a blank piece of paper was an opportunity for a work of art, and I was to fill that paper, and I was to treat that piece of paper as that opportunity. And each play was a chance to not mimic what was done before, but to apply some process that would bring some new contribution from that play, and that the theater was the spirit of our time, and it was the responsibility of the theater to lead us to better times or different times.
When you went to school, did you have an end vision of what you thought you might do eventually?
Absolutely not a pure vision. I thought that I probably would be a teacher, because these teachers were so great. I thought that would really be a wonderful thing for me to be, also, was to be a teacher.
But did you think it was going to be drawing or painting? Or?
I had no idea. But I loved the theater, and that was really my primary focus, was the theater, and using the art as a designer of scenery, was great skill to have. And it allowed me to design plays that were in whatever mode the director thought would be good. So it could just be something that was a mere suggestion of a place, or it could be a real place. Certainly David Belasco had an influence on everybody, and everything was absolutely real. And there was a real sense of, realism, and the gods of the theater were guys like David Belasco, Stanley McCandless, Louis Hartman, and several others. And realism was very, very, much a thing of that time, as well as some of the abstract things you learned about Kandinsky and his influence on art, his influence on the world through his teaching at the Bauhaus. You saw all the works of the great artists. We went on museum tours, and we had a real sense of the spirit of the collaboration of all artists working together, even though the fields were different, whether it was music or dance or acting or whatever. So it was, you know, an extremely rich and kind of privileged time to be going through high school and having such extraordinary faculty, you know, with extraordinary access to the worlds of theater and art.
Were you more involved in the lighting aspect?
No, not at all. Not until the end of my high school career did I tackle a little bit of lighting. I was really more interested in acting. That was what I did mostly. I was an actor. And I was an actor. I was a dabbler in mathematics and a real art student. And the art student part got me into thinking about what the scenery should be and a little bit about how I wanted it to look. And deciding what it is I wished to see, I would have to think about what the light would be. And I would either draw or paint that. You know, so there was a sense of or an impression of what it was I wished to create to this, you know. And you didn't do very much in high school. It was kind of limited, but it was, you know, a major director and a, major art teacher, and it was a major influence.
So let's take it from high school graduation. Where's next?
I went to Brooklyn College, and because of the influence of my parents, you know, it was really clear that I had to be a doctor, a lawyer, or at least a CPA. You know, very, very soon, I was up to my nose in formaldehyde or whatever else was in that, and I didn't like the prescribed math, and I didn't like the prescribed this or that, and I needed something to do that would keep my art and theater influence alive. So I noticed one day on the board there were tryouts for the varsity players. I thought, oh boy, this is hot stuff. I'll go and try out for the play. You know, I was a great actor in high school. I should do well here. I didn't quite understand that there's a difference in level of sophistication between the people who were in college with me, even the entering freshmen, and me, because I was 16 years old at the time. And I was so intimidated by the tryouts that I didn't even get up and say a word when I saw how good these students were. So I went away and moped. A short time after that, the varsity players had an announcement that they were producing a play and they needed help. I guess the play was cast, and now there were other things to do, which I knew about, so I figured I'd show up and see what was happening. And I was listening to this process unfold and watching all these very elegant, sophisticated older folks than me, you know, at least in their 20s, you know, do this stuff. And I said, well, they were coming down near the end of the list, and somebody said, we need somebody to work on the lighting. I said, this is my last chance. I'll do that. So I raised my hand. I was the only one. They said, okay, you, come up here. And so I did. And it was startling to me, because it was something I had thought about, you know, in high school, and had done a little with it, but nothing I ever was deeply involved in. And there I was, working on the lighting with a really very, very smart designer, you know, who knew all this stuff. And I learned about Stanley McCandless and all these people for the real thing. You know, I got a book and read it, you know, began to do some other stuff to bone up on this thing that I volunteered to do. You know, I needed to know things like electricity. So I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't electrocute myself, because I had to wires and drag things here and there and hang instruments and focus them and see how they all work. And I got all of that, you know, and I learned that very fast and worked on it very furiously. And on the next show, I had done so well that they let me do it. The remarkable thing was I didn't know anything really. And that lack of knowledge, or that wonderful naivete, allowed me to think about how I wished every scene to look. I could recite every word of that play. I knew where every actor stood, and I composed what I wished each word to look like. So it was not just the sequence of words. It was as if I was trying to turn those words into a visual image that reinforced whatever that was. It was a forever process. And it turned out to be fairly well received. Then they said that I could light one of these little, this was in the main theater of the school, which was a tiny theater, about a 300-seater. But they were in the process of building this enormous theater complex with a 1,500-seat auditorium, a 500-seat theater, and a big 3,000-seat amphitheater. This was in process. And it was going to have all the latest stuff. So this became extremely exciting to me. It would be one of 3 major theaters in the university system in the country at the time. And I was going to do this little theater program, and in an experimental theater. And I thought about it and thought about what I had to do, and it was really clear that you couldn't do good lighting in that theater. There was not enough power to hook up enough lights, and there was not enough control that good lighting could be done. But I was not shy, even though I was, you know, probably just going on 17, and thought, well, that could be solved. And we have lots of cable in the main theater, and we're not using the main theater during the experimental season. I would just run cable through the air conditioning, through the ventilation ducts down from the main theater to the little theater, and I'd use the main theater board. One of the theater aficionados of the school was a man named Jim Peterson, and he was the superintendent of buildings and grounds. And he came to the play, as I found out he came to every play after this one. And at the end of the show, he called me over and he said, you know, that's the best lighting I've ever seen done in the little theater. And he said, and I finally figured out how you did it. And if you don't remove all of that stuff at once, I'm going to have you thrown out of school. And you got to promise me you will never do that again. Well, he was terrifying. This guy was 6'4", a big Norwegian guy. And then he called me over and said, you're very industrious, and everything you did was safe. It's just, we don't do that here. He said, but we're building a new theater, which of course I knew. He said, I need somebody like you to work in that. How would you like a job as a member of the staff of Buildings and Grounds to take care of that thing? And by that time, I had really studied up on George Eisenhower and Stanley McCandless, thyrotron tube dimmers, everything else. I now knew somewhat a little more than electricity. And
what year was that?
1953.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that's right. And I went and watched them put that theater together and made sure that all the components were going in right, and it was really a remarkable bit of architectural education, and working with one of the more illustrative architects of our time, Serge Chermayeff, of the famous Cambridge 7. He was the father of Ivan Chermayeff and Peter Chermayeff, and Serge Chermayeff was the architect of this building, which some of the faculty called Chermayeff's Revenge. But for me, it was a gift of the greatest toy anyone could have, because it was so superbly equipped that there was probably nothing you couldn't do. The Broadway shows did not have this kind of control equipment. They were still using resistance dimmer boards and small preset boards, and the big theaters had auto transformer dimmers. Only Radio City Music Hall had one of these gadgets.
Mm-hmm. And this gadget was?
The big Cybertron tube Eisenhower multi-scene preset board. And the other one was a big Ward Leonard magnetic amplifier board. And so I was there putting in all the new stuff and being given a modicum of control with my job in the Department of Buildings and Grounds. And it was fascinating. By then I was beginning to learn some of the protocols of lighting. One of the great things about being at Brooklyn College at the time was that, again, it was amazing good fortune that a man named Vance Morton was the head of the theater department. And Vance Morton was one of the most distinguished directors in educational theater. And he came to Brooklyn College because of this new theater and brought with him a whole gifted design team. And so again, I was just another ramp up on the chance to do all this stuff.
Do you remember the instruments that you had to work with?
It was all the standard theater equipment. There were, piles of Fresnels of every size, piles of beam projectors, scoops, floods, border lights, ellipsoidal reflector spotlights of every size imaginable, and hundreds upon hundreds of them, because there were 3 theaters. So you didn't have to leave them in the theaters. You could do whatever you wished to do. You could just borrow from Peter to pay Paul, as long as the shows were okay, and the touring companies that came through were serviced well. And here I was, just a kid doing that. They came to me at the end of we still hadn't moved into the theater, and it was felt very strongly that they needed to get somebody to be a teaching assistant, because with this new place they would need an enlarged staff. The faculty felt that would be a good idea. And so I thought, wow, I'm going to have somebody else coming here. He'll come from Yale or Iowa or one of the Northwestern University, and I was beginning to know all the folks who were something else, all the guys who were considered special. And even though I hadn't met them, I certainly knew where to find out about them and read their books and all of the things that they did. And there was something in me, and I think it was probably Gustav Bloom and and Erwin Piscator and Leon Friend, who said, that's the way they do it. That's what made them special. What should I do? So I thought, oh, well, I've got to do something here. And
so did you go from student to full-time employee?
No. I was still a student. Still a student. Okay. They gave me a graduate teaching assistantship, and they allowed me to do a certain amount of design and supervision through my job as a member of the staff of Buildings and Grounds. And I needed that job because my parents were paupers. I mean, it was took all they could do to buy me a $17 bicycle. The thing that was so great about that is that when the theater was finished, that I could live rent-free because I moved a hammock into the sub-basement of the theater until they found me and kicked me out of there. And then I had to pay rent again. But
so let's jump ahead a little bit. Where did you, after you finished there?
Well, was coming close to finishing. I had, we were doing all of this stuff, and because of this was such a huge order, Century Lighting got the order, I went I met the famous Stanley McCandless, and I met, I met the famous Rollo Gillespie Williams and some other luminaries of the lighting world, the famous Edward F. Cook, who was the owner of Century Lighting. And I was doing this amazing production. I can't remember the name of it, unfortunately. But I felt that there was a special effect that needed to be done, and I rented 100 more beam projectors. This was for about a 4-minute effect, and I invited Stanley McCandless to the show. When he heard that I had rented, because one of the guys, the electricians from the rental division, told him that I had rented 100 of these things, he came to see it. That's got me, when I graduated, that was one of two things that got me the job. The second one, we did a show called Peer Gynt, and I was one of the designers for the show and wanted to do the entire set with very allegorical scenery, and I was going to do projections, and I was looking at Wilfrid projectors and all the famous scene projectors of the time, and there were none that would fill a 36-foot high, 97-foot around cyclorama. So I said, well, that's not a problem. I will design special Linnebach projectors that will fill that screen. And again, this time a whole pile of people came to see that show. Some guys from Broadway here and there showed up, and they looked at this stuff. And the minute I graduated, I got this job to be Stanley McCandless's assistant.
Wow.
That got me up to becoming, I did other things. I did off-Broadway shows, I did nightclub shows. I was really doing pretty well for a little kid. And I even got the Actors Equity Award for the best production of the season one year for a revival of The Corn is Green. And then I went to work for Stanley McCandless.
Well, after reading his books for all those years, what was he really like?
Oh, Stanley McCandless was a very, very courtly gentleman, very distinguished, elegant person. He always wore a 3-piece suit, always wore a hat, a skimmer in the summer. You never... What's
a skimmer?
One of those straw hats that they wear at Oxford.
Yeah.
and I would sit there, and he would take me around, as his assistant, and I met all kinds of famous people. I met Frank Lloyd Wright, Eero Saarinen, Kevin Roach, just a who's who, just by being on his coattails. And he would always introduce me as, here's the spoiled brat of the lighting industry. Having all this stuff.
Well, the time you went to work for him was Century building architectural lighting?
Yes. They were in the architectural lighting building business.
Mostly theater.
But they were mostly known for theater, but they had a large and very vigorous, architectural lighting department. And getting put there with Stanley McCandless as the head of research, we were always looking at things. I learned to design optical systems. I did, since I was the low man on the totem pole in the assistant department, I had to do all the photometry. And I just did, all the dirty work. I also, though, got to design a lot of stuff, because the minute it was given to me, I would do it, no matter what it was.
Was McCandless at the time doing architecture, or was he doing only theater?
Both.
Did he?
Stanley McCandless was an architect.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And he served his apprenticeship, I believe, with McKim, Mead and White. And I served my apprenticeship with him. He sent me back to school to study architecture. And he and Wally Harrison got me in with a number of exemptions, so I didn't have to do everything. And that was really quite wonderful. I think the critical path of Delta, or change in my life, came from the fact that that things that I knew would work just from experience with all those shows and things were never good enough for Stanley McCandless. You had to show him all the calculations. Now, calculations in those days were not done on a computer. And I was, from school and dabbling in mathematics, I had a thing called a slide rule. Now, McCandless never trusted those things and did everything with log tables and trig tables. He would not use a slide rule.
Now, we're talking about calculations for architecture or for theater?
We never calculated for the theater.
Okay.
We calculated only for architecture. With a theater, he had enough faith that if I put that light into this theater, that it would work. Everything was pre-calculated. We calculated all the theater lighting equipment for the catalog. It was pre-calculated, so you knew how much light you'd get and what the beam spread was for every throw distance. You could just do it off a chart. So he could look at the chart. He was as comfortable with looking at charts to check things as he was in looking up things in log and trig tables. He was a good mathematician. And he knew his photometry cold, and he knew all the technical stuff cold. And if you were doing, we were doing the University of Pennsylvania women's dormitories with Sarnen, and I had to show him I had to calculate every last thing I did after the fact before he would accept the work. And it was things like that.
Okay. In what year was this that we were?
We're now in the very early 50s.
Okay. Obviously, you didn't have lots of power lamps back then.
No, we had power lamps.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
64s and 56s?
Yeah. Not tungsten halogen, but they were ordinary power lamps. We had par 38 lamps. It was interesting to learn that Stanley McCandless got a patent on parabolic reflectors for architectural lights in 1935. The first patent. And the first parabolic fluorescent units were made by Century in the 50s.
Wow.
And all those parabolic things, all of those principles were there. And I would do these short form mathematical things, and McCandless would say, "You've got to write about this stuff. You've got to write about this stuff." But I wasn't interested in writing about anything at that time. I was only interested in about doing, and I would forget about it the next minute and figure something else out, the next thing I wanted to do, which used to drive him crazy sometimes. But he drove me equally crazy, not because he was intending to, because he spoke about things that I knew nothing about. Of course, I would never admit it, but I'd immediately write it down and go and find out.
Can you give us an example?
The only example that really is clear to me, Warren Plattner, who was one of Vero Sarnen's partners, came in one day and we were discussing a job, and McCandless was telling him all about how this would work and that would work, and I'm sitting there goggle-eyed listening to all of this. And finally, Warren knew that I had to do all the work because that's the way things were. They still are today. There's the studio master, and then somebody does it. He looked at me and said, "Do you understand that?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, come outside and explain it to me." I went outside and I said, "The way things work around here, he says them, I write them down, I look them up and find out, and then I'll let you know." Because when I get really stuck, I'll go back and ask him. But it was a hell of an apprenticeship. with opportunities to do things as a young person, in their early 20s, that I never would have been able to do. And with all of the changes that were occurring in lighting at the time, it was almost like a violent eruption. Richard Blackwell had entered the scene with all of his new theories on vision and what it took to all his measurements of what it took to see, and it was good stuff. I mean, it really was very, very good stuff. This application of psychophysics to vision and lighting. And there were all kinds of great researchers and papers being given, and Rollo Williams who was another one of the people who worked there, was going to be the president of the New York section of the Illuminating Engineering Society in 1959, and those guys, and probably one of the most important guys in lighting who's unknown is Sonny Sonnenfeld. Those two guys talked me into joining the Illuminating Engineering Society in 1959, and to be active, not just to be a member.
Okay, so all the lighting that you did was a free service for architects?
No, it was not a free service. Stanley McCandless was a private consultant. He taught at Yale. He worked as head of research part-time at Century Lighting, and he had a lighting design practice. There were very few people practicing lighting design like that at that time. There was Richard Kelly, Thomas Smith Kelly, Edison Price, and forget his name. Very, very important guy. His name will come to me later. But they were very, very few people. And McCandless was always very careful, because I would try and figure out all these extravagant things, and he would worry about the charges that would go to his clients, because I was being billed at the outrageous rate of $7.50 an hour. And being a pure Scotsman, he could stretch a penny from here to Alaska. And
what kind of fees was he charging to do an architectural piece? Hundreds of dollars?
A small thing, he would charge maybe $1,000. If it was a really big thing, it might be $2,000 or $3,000. Some small thing he would have me do, whatever the time came to. Okay. I might finish it in 5 hours.
Was he the director of the design?
Oh yes, he was the director of the design. He was the guy, but we were given a lot of freedom. I mean, Stanley McCandless was the world's best mentor. I mean, his whole goal was to give you a leg up in design so that you could do the best possible work you could. I always knew, it was never spoken, but I knew from all of the other people who were his students at Yale that his main goal in life was to teach people everything he knew and to inspire them so that they could do better work in their time than he did in his. That was an unspoken but definite goal of his.
Was his design philosophy something very easy to understand?
It was.
Or was he a mystery man?
No, he was not a mystery man at all. I mean, he was a very, very practical guy. And one of the things that is testimony to his practice, his practicality, and his humility was the title of his book, A Method of Lighting the Stage. He could have called it The Method of Lighting the Stage, but he didn't. It is a method. Stanley McCandless answered his own phone. Anybody who called and asked for him got through to him. You were supposed not to abuse his time. or the privilege, but he was that way.
When he worked with an architect, who was driving the show?
It was a team effort. It was a definite team effort. They would talk about it and talk about what the goal was. They would see how to do it. A lot of the equipment that was designed at Century Lighting at that time came out of the problems that we got out of practice. We learned that, gee, we need a light to do this, or we need a light to do that. Oh, we can do that. You know, that's not a big deal. And those became very, very good things. Rollo Williams did all the color theory work, and he had this system called Rollo Color, which is now in a museum at Penn State University, in the Theater Museum. And there were remarkable discoveries all the time, including the Thyrotron tube dimmer board, the silicon control rectifier dimmer boards, the computer dimmer boards that George Eisenhower, who also taught at Yale, also worked part-time, and did all this stuff. It was like the think tank of the world. And we were all connected to architecture and to the theater because of Century Lighting's goal. And we would go to private seances at the Actors Studio and listen to debates and work on all these wonderful theaters with great directors. And there I was on the coattails of Stanley McCandless those years, sopping all of this up, going to school at night and working like a Trojan. Every one of those jobs was like food.
Do you remember some of your first lighting design jobs when you're working with McCandless and how your philosophy worked in with his? Or any projects that kind of stand out as being difficult or easy or...
I was a philosophy minor in college and had, because of that minor in philosophy, a different philosophic base. Mine was a more of a practice, amateur philosopher's point of view than most of the other people practicing. And that is one of the things that I got from school, studying, using philosophy as a minor to bring a different background. I had to really know what something was. The lighting was for me, if I didn't understand clearly, it was like the lines in the play that had to be orchestrated like music or had to fit in a rhythm like poetry, and if it didn't do that, it should not be. And that came right from philosophy. It came straight from Bertrand Russell. And the essay that I wrote my final paper on was Russell, The Elements of Ethics. And for me it was the elements of design. It's what ought to be. And I knew that you couldn't get a book and look up what ought to be. You could find design rules, but they changed all the time. And it really became very simple that the rule was that rules were a substitute for thinking. That was my basic philosophy. So if you needed to know how to do something, we could give you we could show you how to do this. But that's where you would stay. It's the next time you had the opportunity to do something, if you could expand on that. So if you've seen it before, you shouldn't do it.
Only do something new.
Only do something new. Now, you could be looking at something new and not know it, because you really have to learn to see. And the theater and art taught me to see. Going to the theater and going to the ballet and going to the concerts and going to the art forums and listening to all of this and being one wing-ding debater. If somebody said it was white, I would say it was black. It was clear to me that that the quality of the thought was measured by the ferocity of the argument you could generate over it. And some guys around the IS and the IALD understand that very clearly. You know, they have been in wicked debates with me when I didn't agree. But all of those guys have changed their minds. And there's lots of things that are no more that were in the handbook that have vanished because of that simple philosophy. But that's where it came from. I mean, it really came from this very rich education I had, you know, at that time. It was right at the end of the WPA program, and I was right there, sopping up all this stuff like a sponge and getting the opportunities to try it out. And Sonny Sonnenfeld was very, very supportive. I mean, I owe an awful lot to Sonny Sonnenfeld, because McCandless would always be worrying about how much money some of these designs would cost. And Sonny was thinking, boy, if they buy these designs, look at the sales we're going to make. And, you know, and so he would be encouraging me on the one hand, and McCandless would be also encouraging me, but he brought a remarkable restraint. Stanley McCandless taught me that budget and design are synonyms, and that if it didn't meet the budget, it was a failure. And that lesson I have stuck with. I mean, we would design to a budget. It was how imaginative you could be within that budget that was really the key. It was also really very clear to me, having had this extravagant theater to work in after working in a very minor theater, and having these wonderful projects to work on, because I was Stanley McCandless's assistant and I started at the top because of that. It became remarkably clear that the design and budget were truly synonyms. And it was really easy to do a low-budget job. It was very hard to do a big-budget job, because the client is entitled to greater expectations, and you better fulfill them if he's willing to spend that money.
Well, back in the 50s, what was a big project budget?
Even in the 50s, it cost, big buildings cost millions of dollars to build. They don't cost 50 and 100, but they still cost. I mean, you can just look at the thing. You know, I made $75 a week. I mean, I couldn't survive on $75 an hour now. You know, my father, when I was growing up in the late 30s and early 40s, made $15 a week, working 6 days a week, washing cars on a used car lot. I made more a minute than he did a week. You know, and so, you know, the value hasn't changed, just the dollar numbers have changed.
But proportionally back then, buildings were still expensive.
Nothing was cheap. You know, Mr. Blandings builds his dream house. You want a socket over there? $15. Just try it today for $15. Then they get an extra socket added into your house. But that, you know, but you know, it's just the money is worthless today.
But for example, back then, if you were doing a par 38 downlight, was it a $35 downlight? No,
it probably wasn't. You could buy downlights for $5. You could get fancy downlights for $15.
Oh.
You know, you know, you could get, you know, you pay $50. There was a lot. Some units, like those early parabolic louver fluorescent units, they were very expensive. I think they were running about $15 a foot at that time because they were all handmade. There was no machinery to bat them out like they do now, like machine gun bullets. You know, it took 4 guys to build a border light. Now they come off the assembly line like, you know, all extrusions and all heavy duty, CDC machines, computers, and that whacking out the metal. It was totally different then. Most of that stuff was a craft work.
It's really strange sitting in this room because the room every once in a while tilts on me, and I have to look to the side windows in order to get the perspective back. It's very strange.
We intended this to be a special place, and it's just to sit here and look out across the prairie, and occasionally you'll see a hawk light on one of the fence posts or an owl, and you can watch the animals hunt, and you can see coyotes go by, or an occasional wolf, occasional deer if you look out that way. Other than that, the wind is about all you hear.
Do you ever wake up some morning and have the room start to turn on you?
Nope.
Never have?
No.
Okay. Well, maybe it's just the perspective from here, but every once in a while it looks like the fireplace is going to lift up.
No, it's not. Everybody thought this house was going to blow away in the wind. Whenever we had a north wind, it was going to come underneath the house and just blow over.
Well, how many people have driven by and thought it already had blown over? First time I saw it, I said, my God, it looks like it's already blown over.
Yeah, I know.
Let's take a break here.
Okay.